5 in the morning. November. The building was dark, except for a single bulb hanging from a wire at the far end of the corridor, swaying slightly in a draft that came from somewhere in the old stone walls. Walter Crane stood at a workbench he had built from scrap lumber and salvaged brackets running a handplane across a piece of white oak he had been given by a farmer 2 weeks ago. The motion was slow and deliberate. Push, lift, reset. Push, lift, reset. The way a man moves when he is not in a hurry, because the work itself is the point. He was 76 years old. His knees ached every morning now, a deep grinding that started before he even opened his eyes. His lower back tightened in cold weather, which in Ohio meant it tightened most of the year. And the index finger on his left hand had been crooked since 1981, when he broke it on a job site and couldn't afford to miss a day of work. So he splinted it himself with a paint stick and electrical tape and kept swinging a hammer until the bone healed wrong. He never thought of that finger as a defect. It was a record. A mark left by a day. He chose the work over his own comfort, the way he had chosen it hundreds of times before and hundreds of times after. Push, lift, reset. Outside the barred windows of this place, Ohio was beginning to lighten at the edges, gray going to pale blue, the last stars fading over the cornfields on Hadley Road. And inside the building and the rooms behind him, 12 people were sleeping. People who had come to this place with nothing. People who had found something here and were slowly building on it. He had built the rooms they were sleeping in. He had built the doors on those rooms. Solid wood doors hung on hinges he had salvaged or bought with donated money. Doors that latched from the inside. He had built the beds inside those rooms, and the shelves and the kitchen counters, and the long table in the common room where they all sat together every evening. Walter Crane set the handplane down and looked at his hands in the light of that single bulb. 76 years old, 42 years of carpentry. And a year ago, these hands had nothing to do. That was the worst of it. Not the motel room off the highway, not the 2 suitcases on the curb, not the silence of a phone that never rang. The worst of it was sitting on the edge of that motel bed with nowhere to go, and looking down at his hands and having no answer for them. He had that answer now. To understand how Walter Crane ended up in an abandoned county jail on a gravel road in Ohio with 12 people sleeping behind the doors he had built, you have to go back a year. You have to go back to a Saturday morning in October and a black SUV parked in the driveway of the house where he had lived for 31 years. You have to go back to the morning his son kept a promise he never intended to keep. Walter Crane had been a carpenter for 42 years in Caldwell County, Ohio. He had framed houses and built additions and laid hardwood floors and crafted kitchen cabinets and set custom staircases in homes that belonged to families who needed more room or wanted something finer than what they had. He had worked for developers and contractors and directly for homeowners who wanted to watch their dream take shape from the ground up. He was good at the work, not famous for it, not wealthy from it, but good in the way that matters most in a trade, which is that the people who hired him once almost always hired him again, and the things he built did not fall apart. He had built his first bookshelf at 14 using scrap wood from his father's garage and a handsaw he had to borrow because he didn't own one yet. The shelf was uneven, and one of the joints wasn't square, but it held books for 30 years before anybody thought to replace it. His father kept it in the basement long after it had any practical use, long after Walter had the skill to build something 10 times better. When his father died, Walter took the shelf with him. It was in the corner of his workshop now, still holding books, still slightly uneven, still the truest thing he had ever made because it was made before he knew enough to be afraid of getting it wrong. His wife Eleanor had been a third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary School for 35 years. She retired at 68, and the school gave her a plaque and a cake. She put the plaque in a drawer and gave the cake to her neighbors because she wasn't someone who needed a plaque to know what her years had been worth. Eleanor Crane knew the names of every child she had ever taught, not as a feat of memory, as a habit of attention. She learned them before school started each year from the enrollment forms, and by the second day, she could call on any child in the room without hesitation. She had seen what it meant to a 7-year-old to be called by name by someone who had chosen to learn it. She had built her entire career on that one small act of respect, repeated thousands of times over 35 years, for children who sometimes had nobody else in the world paying that particular kind of attention to them. They were not rich, Walter and Eleanor. They were the kind of people who made a little go a long way and never talked about it because there was nothing to talk about. You worked. You saved what you could. You fixed what broke. You stretched what you had until it covered what you needed. The house on Barker Street was 4 rooms when they bought it. Walter added a half bath when the kids were small. He put a new roof on every 12 years whether it needed it or not. He built the front porch himself in 1988 using good lumber because he didn't believe in using cheap materials on anything you were going to have to look at every day for the rest of your life. They raised 3 children in that house. Richard, the oldest, who was driven and smart and certain from the time he was 15 that he was meant for larger things. Catherine, the middle child, who was steady and careful and called on Sundays. Daniel, the youngest, who moved to Seattle for a technology job and gradually called less and less as the years went on, the way people sometimes do when distance makes it easy to let things slide. Walter and Eleanor had refinanced their house to pay for Richard's college education. Eleanor picked up tutoring jobs on weekends. Walter took every overtime shift his union contract would allow. Richard graduated, moved to Columbus, built a career in real estate development. Corner office, new car every 2 years, a house with rooms he didn't use. Walter and Eleanor did not resent this. They had given everything so their children could have more, and their children did have more. That had been the whole point. The first sign that something had shifted came when Walter turned 74. Eleanor noticed he was slower on the stairs. He forgot where he put his reading glasses more often than he used to. Sometimes at dinner he would ask the same question twice, not remembering he had already asked it. She didn't say anything to Walter because Walter was proud, and his pride was the one thing he had never been willing to spend. But she called Richard and mentioned it the way you mention the weather casually, something to note but not to alarm. Richard said he would look into options. He looked into options for 2 years. Then, on a Saturday morning in October, his black SUV turned into the driveway on Barker Street. He had not visited in 8 months. Catherine was in the passenger seat. Daniel had not come because he was busy with a project. Walter was in the kitchen when he heard the car. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and watched his son get out of the vehicle in a wool overcoat that must have cost more than Walter's first set of power tools. Richard was 48 years old. He had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw and the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years being the smartest person in most of the rooms he walked into. Eleanor set her coffee cup down. Richard came inside and stood in the kitchen where Eleanor had cooked 10,000 meals, and he said the thing he had practiced Walter was almost certain in front of a mirror or during the drive down from Columbus. "We found a place for you both. It's a good facility, clean, well-reviewed. You'll be comfortable there. A facility. Eleanor picked up her coffee cup again, then set it back down without drinking from it. It's temporary, Richard said. Just while we sort out the situation with the house. Property taxes went up again, and with Dad's medical costs, the numbers don't work the way they used to. What numbers? Walter asked. The finances, Dad. We've gone over this. They had never gone over anything. Richard had never once sat down with his parents and discussed their finances, but he said it the way he said things in business presentations, with the confidence of someone who has decided that what he is saying is true. Walter looked at his son. He was a carpenter. He had spent 42 years reading structures, finding the load-bearing elements, understanding where a thing would hold and where it would give. He was looking at his son now, the same way he looked at a building, and what he saw was a man who had made a decision before he walked through the door and was now performing the announcement of that decision rather than having a conversation about it. Catherine stood behind Richard with her arms crossed and her eyes on the kitchen floor. Eleanor had spent 35 years reading children's faces. She looked at her daughter, and she knew. Catherine knew this wasn't temporary. Catherine had known before they left Columbus, and she was standing there with her eyes on the floor because she was ashamed of what she knew and wasn't going to say it. But Walter believed Richard. This is the thing that is hardest to explain and the thing that is most important to understand. Walter Crane had never broken a promise in his life, not a small one, not a large one, not once. And because of that, because integrity was the organizing principle of everything, he could not make himself imagine that his own son had driven 3 hours to stand in this kitchen and tell a lie. So when Richard said it was temporary, Walter heard it is temporary. He went to the bedroom and began to pack. 2 suitcases. That was what 42 years of marriage and 42 years of carpentry and 35 years of teaching came down to. 2 suitcases and whatever fit inside them. Eleanor packed their clothes, their medications, Walter's reading glasses, her Bible, and 1 photograph. Their wedding day, 1972. Walter in a borrowed suit because he didn't own one yet. Eleanor in her mother's dress because she hadn't had time or money for anything else. Both of them grinning at the camera the way people grin when they have just promised each other something and they mean every word of it. She put the photograph in her purse. Something told her she would need it. She couldn't have explained what that something was, but she listened to it the way she had learned over 73 years to listen to the things she couldn't explain. Richard drove them to the Pine View Motor Lodge off Route 9. The neon sign outside was missing 2 letters. The parking lot had potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and old cigarette smoke, and the particular staleness of air that has been recycled through a window unit for too many years. This is temporary, Richard said one more time, setting the suitcases down on the curb. I'll call you this week. Then he got back in the black SUV and drove away. Walter stood on the motel parking lot and watched the vehicle until it disappeared around a curve. The October wind came off the fields and pushed through his jacket. Eleanor stood beside him and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say yet. "Inside," she said finally. "It's cold." He picked up both suitcases and carried them in. The motel cost $30 a night cash only. They had $220. Eleanor did the arithmetic quietly in her head while Walter tested the faucet in the bathroom and found that it dripped. He took the handle apart, looked at the washer inside, found that it had deteriorated completely. He put it back together the best he could without parts, which improved things somewhat. The motel manager, a woman in her early 50s named Patricia, with the kind of tired eyes that come from decades of small emergencies, noticed what he had done when she came by to check the room. She knocked on the door of room 12 the next morning and asked if he could look at a hinge that had pulled away from the frame. He fixed it. She knocked $7 off their bill. But arithmetic is arithmetic. $30 a night against $220 does not improve no matter how you move the numbers around. Eleanor calculated it out on the back of a gas station receipt while Walter was in the shower. 5 days, maybe 6 if they were careful with food. Bread and peanut butter from the gas station across the road. Coffee from the machine in the motel office that cost 50 cents a cup and tasted like it. Richard did not call that week. Eleanor tried his number on the 3rd day. Voicemail. She tried it again on the 5th day. Voicemail. She tried Catherine. Voicemail. She tried Daniel. The number was no longer in service. Walter sat on the edge of the motel bed that evening and looked at his hands. He had been looking at his hands his whole life the way craftsmen do, checking them the way a pilot checks instruments, checking for cuts, for splinters, for the dryness that came from too much contact with sawdust and solvents, checking that the fingers moved the way they were supposed to move, that the grip was still there, that nothing had stiffened in the night. Now he looked at them and had no answer for them, no wood waiting to be shaped, no frame waiting to be squared, no door waiting to be hung. Just 2 old hands sitting in his lap in a motel room off Route 9 with the faucet in the bathroom still dripping because he hadn't been able to fix it properly without parts. "He'll call?" Walter said. Eleanor was sitting in the chair by the window. She looked at him. "I know," she said. She didn't argue. She had learned in 42 years the difference between the moments when Walter needed to be challenged and the moments when he needed to be allowed to believe something a little longer. This was the second kind of moment. They went to the church on the 7th day when the money had dropped below $100. The pastor, a tall man named Reverend Douglas Holt, who shook hands with both hands, was kind and honest in equal measure. He could give them 2 nights in the fellowship hall. After that, the best he could offer was a list of shelters in the county. Walter looked at that list and did not say what he was thinking. Shelters. Walter Crane, who had built houses with his own hands for 4 decades, who had framed walls that were still standing in homes across Caldwell County, who had set staircases that would outlast everyone who ever walked them, was being handed a list of shelters. He folded the list and put it in his jacket pocket and thanked the pastor and did not say what he was thinking. They slept on cots in the fellowship hall, surrounded by folding chairs and the faint ghost of Sunday coffee. Eleanor slept. Walter lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and turned the same question over and over in his mind until it was smooth from handling. How did we get here? On the second morning, Eleanor put on her coat and her good shoes and said she was going to find information. Walter asked where she was going. She said she would tell him when she got back. Eleanor Crane walked 2 blocks to the Caldwell County Records Building, a limestone structure that had been on the same corner since 1931. She had spent 35 years knowing how to find information and who to ask for it. She knew that the person who can actually help you is almost never the first person you speak to. But if you are patient and specific and make it easy for them to understand what you need, you will eventually get to the right person. The clerk at the property records desk was a young woman with dark-framed glasses and the careful manner of someone who takes her work seriously. Her name tag said Julie Prentice. Eleanor explained plainly and without self-pity that she and her husband needed a place to live and had almost no money. Oh, Julie Prentice typed something into her computer. She frowned at the screen. Then she said there was a property in the delinquent tax listings that had been sitting for years with no buyers. An old county jail on Hadley Road, about 12 miles east of town, abandoned since 1997. How much? Eleanor asked. $6. That's the county minimum. What condition is it in? Julie Prentice paused. It's still standing. That's the most I can tell you. Eleanor walked back to the fellowship hall and told Walter what she had found. He was quiet for a long time. He sat at the table in the corner of the fellowship hall, the one with the wobble in the left rear leg that nobody had gotten around to fixing, and he looked at the list of shelters that was still in his jacket pocket. A jail, he said. A building, Eleanor said. With walls and a roof. $6, Walter. We have 11 left. Can I see it first? The pastor drove them out that afternoon. 12 miles east through the flat agricultural middle of Ohio in late autumn, the fields gray-brown and wading the sky the color of old pewter. The pavement ended and became gravel, and the gravel road went on for another mile between ditches grown up with last year's weeds, and then it ended in a clearing. The jail sat at the center of that clearing like something the earth had been slowly digesting for 30 years. 2 stories of limestone and granite solid as the county courthouse with barred windows on every side and a front entrance flanked by concrete pillars that had cracked and shifted. The roof was intact but sagged in the middle. Weeds pushed through the front steps. A chain hung across the door, and the padlock on the chain had rusted open decades ago. Walter got out of the car. He stood in the clearing and looked at the building the way he had looked at every building he had ever worked on, which was to say he did not see what was wrong with it first. He saw its bones. He saw what it was made of, and how it had been put together, and why it was still standing. Limestone foundation, he said almost to himself. That's why it's still here. This county built its jails to last. He walked to the nearest wall and pressed his palm flat against the stone. Cold. Completely dry. He looked up at the roof line, reading the sag, estimating the cause. He walked around the building's perimeter, stopping at each corner, checking the drainage around the base, looking for the signs of water intrusion that would tell him how bad the damage was inside. He found 2 places where the roof had let water in. 2. On a building that had been sitting empty for nearly 30 years. Eleanor had gone inside while he was doing his inspection. She pushed the door open, the chain falling away in her hand, and stepped into the main corridor. Dim and cold. Cells lining both sides, floor-to-ceiling iron bars, concrete floors that had been stained by decades of neglect. An old processing desk near the entrance, its surface layered with dust and mouse droppings. A bulletin board on the wall still held a faded notice dated June 1993. She walked to the nearest cell and reached through the bars and placed her hand on the interior wall. Solid. Dry. Not a trace of moisture. Walter came in and found her there. He walked the length of the corridor without speaking. He counted the cells, estimated their dimensions, looked at the ceiling height, noted where the electrical conduit ran inside the walls. He went upstairs and walked the 2nd floor. He found the storage room in the back with the old maintenance supplies nobody had ever bothered to remove. He came back to where Eleanor was standing. 2 spots where water got in, he said. Manageable. Electrical conduit is still in the walls, panel is dead, but the infrastructure is there. Plumbing was shut off at the main valve. Pipes are old iron, but the runs are intact. Roof needs work, but it's not compromised structurally. Can you work with it? Walter was quiet for a moment. He put his hand on the bars of the cell Eleanor had been touching. Solid iron bolted into stone. He pushed against them. They did not move. The bones are good, he said. Can you work with it? She asked again. He looked at her. 42 years. She was standing in a derelict county jail in the October cold, with her coat buttoned to her throat and her good shoes on the shoes she had worn to walk to the records building and back, and she was asking him the only question that mattered. I can work with anything that has good bones, he said. He took out his wallet. He counted out $6. He had 5 left. He handed the 6 to the pastor and asked if he would stop at the county records office on the way back to town. The pastor looked at the money. He looked at the building. He looked at Walter. Are you sure about this? Walter looked at Eleanor. Something passed between them that did not need to be said aloud, that didn't need words at all after 4 decades of choosing each other every single day. No, Walter said, but I'm sure about her. They spent their first night on the concrete floor of the cell closest to the front entrance. Walter wedged the outer door shut with a piece of wood he found in the corridor. Eleanor folded her overcoat into a pillow and laid it on the ground. They had no electricity, no running water, no heat. The November air had gotten into the stone over decades, and it was not going to leave just because 2 people were sleeping there now. Walter lay in the dark and listened to the building. He had always done this on jobs. Listened to structures the way a doctor listens to a chest, hearing what was working and what wasn't hearing. The story the building was telling about what it needed. This building talked to him in the wind that moved through the broken windows, in the creak of old iron, settling in the low resonance of stone that has stood through 100 Ohio winters. It did not sound hostile. It sounded like something that had been waiting. Walter. Her voice was steady in the dark. Yeah, we're going to be all right. He found her hand without looking. I know. He didn't know. But he said it the way you say things that need to be true before they are. Sometime in the middle of the night, he heard her get up. He heard the soft tearing of fabric, the small sounds of someone working quietly so as not to disturb anyone. He sat up and looked. In the faint moonlight coming through the barred window, Eleanor was tying a strip of fabric to the bars. She had torn a piece of the burgundy lining from the interior of her suitcase about 2 feet wide, and she was stretching it across the front of the cell, pulling it taut, knotting it at each end. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at what she had made. The fabric caught the moonlight and held it glowing softly against the iron bars. There, she said quietly. Now it's a window. Walter watched her from the floor. This woman who had given 35 years to other people's children and raised 3 of her own and been left on the curb of a highway motel and spent a night on a cot in a church fellowship hall and was now on the floor of an abandoned county jail in Ohio with $5 to her name, and she still had enough of herself left to hang a curtain. He lay back down. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would not diminish what he had just seen. He held her hand, and for the first time in weeks, he slept. Walter Crane woke before dawn. The light was beginning to come, the first gray of it filtering through the barred windows and falling across the concrete floor in long, pale stripes. To most people, that pattern would have looked like a prison. Walter looked at it and saw geometry, saw structure, saw the evidence that someone 60 years ago had built this place with enough care that it was still here. He stood up slowly, his knees registering their objection to the concrete, and he walked the building. All of it this time, systematically, the way you walk a job site before you write an estimate. He counted the cells on both floors. He checked every window opening. He looked at every junction where the roof met the walls. He went into the storage room in the back and opened the old metal toolbox that was sitting on the shelf next to a rusted hatchet and a can of mixed nails. Inside the toolbox was a claw hammer, a handsaw with a dulled blade, a set of chisels wrapped in an oilcloth, and a level. He picked up the level and held it flat on his palm and looked at the bubble. It drifted to the center. Still true. He had owned hand levels worth $200 that read less accurately than this battered old tool someone had left in a county jail storage room 30 years ago. He stood in the dim morning light and looked at the bubble sitting perfectly centered, and he thought about the man who had owned this before him, some county maintenance worker from the 1980s, who probably never imagined that his forgotten toolbox would one day feel like a gift. Walter set the level down carefully on the workbench he was already planning in his mind. Then he went back to where Eleanor was sleeping and sat on the edge of the makeshift bed they had made from their coats, and he waited for her to wake up. When she opened her eyes, he said, "The bones are good. I know what needs to be done." She looked at him for a moment. Then she sat up and reached into her purse and took out the $5 they had left after the $6 they had spent on the deed. She held it out to him without a word. He looked at it. "That won't buy a hammer," he said. "Then we'll have to start with what's already here," she said. He nodded. He thought about the toolbox in the storage room. He thought about the 18 iron bars in the corridor that were doing nothing. He thought about the scrapyard on Route 9 and what iron sold for per pound. He looked at Eleanor, at the woman who had hung a curtain on prison bars and called it a window. "All right," Walter Crane said. "Let's go to work." He started with the iron bars. There were 18 of them running along a dividing section in the interior corridor, a partition that had once separated the processing area from the cell block. Each bar was solid steel about 4 feet long and an inch in diameter, bolted into a frame that had corroded enough to make removal possible with the right leverage and enough patience. Walter worked them loose over 2 days, using the hatchet from the storage room as a pry tool, working each bolt in small increments, a quarter turn at a time, the way you work a rusted fastener when you have no penetrating oil and no replacement if something breaks. His hands bled on the second day from a slip of the hatchet, a shallow cut across the knuckle of his right middle finger that he cleaned with water from the hand pump Eleanor had discovered working in the exercise yard behind the building and wrapped with a strip of cloth torn from the hem of a shirt he no longer needed. He loaded the bars into the old wheelbarrow he had found behind the building and pushed it out to the gravel road and waited. The truck came after about 20 minutes. A Ford with a cracked windshield and a muddy bed, driven by a man in his 60s wearing a canvas jacket and a seed company cap. The man looked at Walter standing on the shoulder of Hadley Road with a wheelbarrow full of iron bars and did not ask many questions because in rural Ohio, a man standing on a county road with a wheelbarrow of scrap metal is not an unusual enough sight to require explanation. His name was Denny Rafferty. He was heading into town. The scrapyard on Route 9 paid Walter $62 for the bars. He walked from the scrapyard to the hardware store on the main street of Millvale, the nearest town, and stood outside for a moment doing arithmetic in his head. $62 from the scrap plus the $5 Eleanor had handed him that morning. $67 total. He needed lumber screws, pipe fittings, electrical wire, weather stripping, and a dozen other things, and $67 was not going to cover it. Not close. He walked in anyway. The store was called Hobbs Hardware. It had been on that corner for 40 years, which you could tell from the way it was organized, not efficiently, but with the accumulated logic of a place that has found a home for every category of thing it has ever sold and is not interested in changing the system now. The floors were wood worn smooth in the traffic lanes. The smell was linseed oil and dust, and the particular mineral smell of nails sold by the pound. The man behind the counter was big through the shoulders and somewhere in his mid to late 70s, with forearms that told the story of a life spent doing physical work and a face that the weather of Ohio had worked on for decades. He was reading an invoice when Walter came in, and he set it down without marking his place. "Help you. I need materials," Walter said. "I have $67 and a lot of work ahead of me." "What kind of work?" "I bought the old county jail out on Hadley Road. My wife and I are fixing it up." The man set the invoice aside completely. "You bought that place, the jail, that's been empty since Clinton was in office. It's not empty anymore." The man came around the counter. He looked at Walter, but not at his face first. He looked at his hands, the scarred knuckles, the calloused palms, the crooked index finger on the left hand. He looked the way someone looks when they are reading something, not inspecting it. "You're a tradesman," he said. "Carpenter, 42 years. The man extended his hand. "Roy Hobbs." Roy walked Walter through the store himself, pulling things from shelves and bins, lumber cuts from orders that hadn't been used, a box of mixed screws, a partial roll of electrical wire, 2 pipe fittings that were the wrong size for their original order and had been sitting on the return shelf for 3 years. At the register, Roy entered numbers into the old mechanical register he had been using since 1987 and had never seen a reason to replace, and when he arrived at a total, he looked at Walter and said, "67 even." Walter knew that wasn't right. The lumber alone, even the offcuts and remnants Roy had pulled, was worth more than that. He said nothing for a moment. Roy said nothing. The register sat between them with its total showing, and the store was quiet except for the furnace cycling on somewhere in the back. "I'll pay you the difference when I can," Walter said. No difference to pay. Those were clearance items. Both of them knew that wasn't true. But Roy began bagging the materials with the settled efficiency of someone who has made a decision and sees no reason to discuss it further. Walter picked up the bags. "Thank you, Roy. Come back when you need more. I always have clearance items." He carried the materials back to the jail on foot. 3 miles uphill on gravel with bad knees and a back that had been filing complaints since he was 65. He stopped twice to rest, setting the bags down at the side of the road and standing with his hands on his thighs and breathing the cold air until his pulse settled. Both times, he picked the bags back up and kept walking. There was no other option that made sense, so he didn't spend any time thinking about one. Eleanor had been busy while he was gone. She had swept the entire first-floor corridor with a broom she made from a sturdy branch and a bundle of dried weeds tied with electrical wire from the storage room. She had cleaned the processing desk near the entrance until the wood grain showed through the decades of grime. She had collected every piece of garbage and every fragment of broken glass and piled it outside the front door. And she had discovered the hand pump in the exercise yard behind the building, a cast iron pump connected to a well that had been sunk before the building was constructed. It had taken her 40 minutes of pumping before the water ran clear, but it ran clear. "We have water," she said when Walter came through the door. He set the bags down, looked at her. Cold, very, but clean. He unloaded the materials and got to work that evening using what light remained, and then working by the beam of a flashlight propped on a ledge. He pulled the bars from the front of the first cell, leaving the frame intact, fitted a salvaged piece of lumber as a header, hung a door he built from the remaining materials on hinges. He pried from a closet in the back of the building. Then he built a bed frame from lumber scraps, sized for a mattress, if they ever had money for one, and laid boards across the top and covered them with their coats. Eleanor washed the cell walls with water and rags, and hung a piece of cloth across the window and set the wedding photograph on the small shelf Walter had nailed to the wall. When they were done, they stood in the doorway and looked at what they had made. It was small. It was plain. The walls were bare stone, and the floor was concrete, and the only decoration was a strip of fabric over a barred window and a photograph taken 50 years ago of two young people who did not know yet what was coming. "It's ours," Eleanor said. And that was the whole of it. Word moved through a small town the way weather moves gradually, and then all at once. The pastor told his congregation in the general and pastoral way of someone sharing community news. Roy Hobbs mentioned it to customers who seemed like they might care. A woman who owned the diner on Millvale's Main Street heard the story third hand and drove out one afternoon with a cardboard box in her back seat. She sat in her car for a while looking at the old jail. Then she got out and walked to the entrance and called inside. Eleanor came to the door. The woman held out the box. Blankets folded, canned goods stacked in careful rows, a jar of instant coffee, a bag of rice, a tin of shortbread from a church basket sale she had been meaning to donate somewhere useful. "I heard about you," the woman said. "I thought you could use these." Eleanor looked at the box for a moment. "Would you like to come in and see what we're doing?" The woman came in. She walked the corridor, looked into the cell that had become a bedroom, looked at the broom Eleanor had made from a branch, looked at the hand pump in the exercise yard through the back door. When she left, she told 3 people what she had seen, and those 3 people told others. Glenn Pruitt drove out on a Tuesday. He was a retired electrician who had worked commercial and residential for 38 years and who had more time than he knew what to do with since his wife had started working at the county library 4 days a week. He looked at the electrical panel, which was long dead, and he looked at the conduit running through the walls, which was still intact, and he spent 2 days running wire and installing junction boxes that met current code. He found a utility pole at the edge of the property with a live connection that nobody had bothered to disconnect when the jail closed in 1997. The meter was still attached. He made a call to a man he knew at the utility company, and the connection was restored without significant bureaucratic difficulty, which is one of the ways that rural Ohio works differently from places where everything requires a form. The first evening that Eleanor walked to a switch on the wall of the corridor and turned on a light, she stood in the hallway for almost a full minute with her hand pressed to her chest. Then she called for Walter. He came out of the cell he was working on and saw the light burning in the corridor, functional electric light in this building that had been dark for 3 decades, and he laughed. A real laugh from somewhere genuine, the kind Eleanor had not heard from him in months. Then he went back to work. A woman from the church brought a camp stove. Another family arrived with a refrigerator in the bed of a pickup, old and noisy but cold, which is the only thing a refrigerator actually needs to be. Walter built a kitchen counter from lumber, installed a donated sink, connected it to the hand pump with pipe fittings from Roy's store. Eleanor claimed the exercise yard. She had looked at it from the first day and seen what it could become, a square of dirt enclosed by a low stone wall open to the sky. She cleared the weeds and the broken concrete and turned the soil with a sharpened shovel and planted seeds from packets she bought at the dollar store in town. Beans, tomatoes, squash, herbs. She planted them in rows as precise and intentional as the lesson plans she had written for 35 years. It was on a Tuesday evening in early December, 6 weeks after they had moved in, that Claire Ashford appeared. Eleanor was in the kitchen heating soup when she heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow steps, uneven like someone who was tired or in pain or both. She dried her hands and went to the front entrance. The young woman standing on the front steps was in her mid-20s, thin in a way that suggested she had not been eating regularly, wearing a jacket that was not designed for Ohio in December. Her dark hair was pulled back roughly. She had a backpack on one shoulder and one hand resting on her stomach, which was round under the jacket, 5 or 6 months along. Eleanor noticed the bruise second, a dark mark along the right side of the young woman's jaw, fading from purple toward yellow. About a week old. She noticed it second, because the first thing she noticed was the young woman's eyes, which were steady and careful in the way of someone who has learned not to show too much. "I'm sorry to bother you," the young woman said. "My car broke down about a mile back. I saw the light. I don't need much, just a phone if you have one." "I have soup," Eleanor said, "and a phone. Come in." The young woman hesitated. She looked past Eleanor into the corridor at the stone walls and the warm light from the kitchen and the row of wooden doors along the hall. "Is this a jail?" "It used to be," Eleanor said. "Now it's a home. Come sit down." Her name was Claire Ashford. She did not offer a last name, and Eleanor did not ask. She ate 2 bowls of soup and 3 pieces of bread, while Eleanor sat across from her and talked about the garden and the donated refrigerator that made a sound like a small animal when the compressor cycled on. Walter came in from working on the 2nd floor. He looked at Claire. He looked at Eleanor. He did not say anything. He went to the pot on the camp stove and filled a bowl for himself and sat down at the far end of the table, close enough to be present, far enough to give the young woman room. "Where are you headed?" he asked after a while, not looking up from his bowl. "Anywhere," Claire said. "I left in a hurry. I had a plan, but the car had other ideas." Walter nodded and ate his soup. 35 years of teaching children had shown Eleanor that people talk when they are ready and not before, and that the best way to earn someone's readiness was to ask nothing and offer everything. "We have an extra room," she said, "if you need a place to sleep tonight." "I can't. I don't have any money." "Did I ask for money?" Claire looked at her. Then she looked at Walter. Then she looked at the kitchen, the warm light, the bowl of soup, the quiet, that felt, she would say later, like the first quiet she had been in for a very long time. She stayed that night. She was still there in the morning. Walter did not say anything about it. He walked into the cell adjacent to theirs, measured the space, and built a bed frame with a lower profile so that a pregnant woman wouldn't have to climb to get in and out. Arthur Bellamy arrived a week later. He was 81 years old and had lived in Millvale his whole life. His wife had died 2 years before, and the medical bills from her final months had taken the house. He had been sleeping in his car in the church parking lot for 3 months. Roy Hobbs had told him about the jail. He stood in the corridor with his hat in his hands, the way a man stands when he is asking for something, and wants to do it with dignity. "Is there room?" he asked. Walter looked down the row of cells he had converted. 8 rooms, each one clean and warm, with a door that latched from the inside and a shelf and a window with a curtain. "Pick whichever one you like," he said. Arthur chose the cell closest to the kitchen. Eleanor made up his bed with donated blankets and set a glass of water on the shelf beside it. That evening, 4 people sat around the table Walter had built and ate dinner together. Nobody called it anything. It was just a building on a gravel road where the door was open. Owen Burke appeared 3 days after Arthur moved in. He was 17 years old, thin in the angular way of a boy who had not quite finished growing, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and carrying a duffel bag that was not full. He stood at the far end of the gravel road for nearly an hour, which Walter noticed from the second-floor window where he was working before finally walking up to the front entrance. Eleanor went to the door. "Is it true you take people in?" he asked. "We have rooms, if you need one. I don't have money. Nobody here does." He told them his name was Owen Burke. His parents had told him to leave 2 months ago, and he had been cycling through places to sleep since then. Friends' couches, a shelter in the next county, the back seat of a car that belonged to someone who eventually asked him to find somewhere else. He had heard about the jail from a girl at the public library who had heard about it from someone at the church. Eleanor showed him a room on the second floor. He walked in, set his bag on the bed, and stood looking at the walls. "This was a jail cell," he said. "It was," Eleanor said. Owen Burke looked at the wooden door with its latch on the inside, at the curtain on the barred window, at the shelf where he could put his things. "Feels safer than most places I've slept," he said. Eleanor left him to settle in. That evening, Walter sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of cardboard and began sketching. Eleanor looked over his shoulder. It was a table, longer than the one they had, much longer. "The current table seats 4, Walter said. "I can see that. We need one that seats 8. Eleanor looked at him. He was bent over the cardboard measuring angles with his thumbnail, the way he always designed things first by feel before he committed anything to formal dimensions. "You think more people are coming," she said. Walter set the pencil down. "I think we stopped asking that question about 2 weeks ago." He built the new table over 3 days. 8 feet long, made from the best of the lumber remnants, and 2 salvaged planks that Roy had set aside for him, sanded until the surface was smooth enough to eat off without a cloth, sealed with a can of oil Roy had donated from his stockroom. It was the best piece of furniture Walter had built in years. He built it from scraps in a jail, and it was better than things he had built in fully equipped shops from premium materials, and he understood why. He was building it for people who needed it. That had always been when he did his best work. The letter from the Caldwell County Code Enforcement Office arrived on a Wednesday. Walter opened it at the kitchen table while Eleanor and Claire washed the breakfast dishes. He read it once straight through, then set it face down on the table and looked at the wall. Eleanor dried her hands and picked it up. Structural assessment, electrical inspection, plumbing evaluation, occupancy standards, fire safety compliance. The letter was formal and bureaucratic, and underneath its official language it said something very simple. The county had noticed that people were living in a building that had been classified as uninhabitable since 1997, and they were sending an inspector to determine whether it should be condemned. 30 days. "If we fail," Walter said, "they condemn the property. We lose everything." Claire was standing at the sink with a dish towel in her hands watching them. Eleanor folded the letter and set it on the table. She looked at her husband. "Then we have 30 days, she said. "Better get started." Walter made his list on the back of a paper bag. 23 items. He organized them by priority, by what an inspector would look at first, by what was most likely to trigger an immediate condemnation if it wasn't right. Top of the list, electrical work to code on both floors. Running water on the second floor. Stair treads and handrails. Window glass in every room where people slept. A fire escape from the second floor. He took the list to Roy Hobbs that afternoon. Roy read it carefully, folded it, and put it in the front pocket of his canvas shirt. "Why are you doing all of this?" Walter asked. It was the first time he had asked it directly. "You don't owe us anything." Roy looked out the store window at the street. Ohio in December, gray and still. "I served in the military," he said. 28 months far from home. He paused. "When I got back, I had nothing. My name was on a list that nobody wanted to look at. Took nearly 3 years before I found real work." "Who helped you?" "A carpenter in Dayton, name of Crawford McAllister. He didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd done. He asked if I could read a level. I said yes. He said $3 an hour, start Monday." Roy looked at Walter. "McAllister died in 2003. I never settled what I owed him." He paused again in the way of a man choosing his words because he means them. "You remind me of him. The way you look at that building. The way you work." McAllister looked at things that way. He picked up an invoice from the counter and set it down again without reading it. "The glass will be there Thursday." 2 days after Walter showed Roy the list, 3 trucks pulled up on the gravel road. Roy drove the first one. Behind him came Glenn Pruitt, back with his tools and an extra 100 feet of wire. And a man Walter hadn't met, a plumber named Hank Dolan, who had retired the previous year and said Roy had told him Walter needed a hand. "I need about 12 hands," Walter said. "You've got 6 between the 2 of us. We'll make it work." They worked through the weekend. Glenn ran wire to the second floor and installed code-compliant junction boxes throughout. Hank replaced the worst sections of iron pipe and got water running to the upstairs bathroom. Walter rebuilt the 2 cracked stair treads and reinforced the railing and patched the 2 spots on the roof where water had been getting in. Claire held flashlights and passed tools and swept up debris. She did this steadily, without being asked, without complaint, moving where she was needed and staying out of the way when she wasn't. Arthur made coffee on the camp stove and brought it around to whoever needed a cup. Owen, the 17-year-old, who had arrived with a duffel bag that wasn't full, turned out to be tireless and willing and quick. He did not know much about construction, but he watched Walter carefully, and by the second day, he was anticipating what was needed next without being told. By Sunday evening, they had cleared 11 items from the list. 12 remained. "The glass is the biggest problem," Roy said, sitting on the front steps with Walter after the others had gone inside. "You can't have open windows in a building where people sleep. Inspector will flag it first thing. Glass is expensive." "I know. I know a man who does window replacements. Has a shop over in Lancaster. I'll make some calls." The glass arrived on Thursday, delivered in a van by a man who said Roy had already handled the payment and who would not discuss it further. New panes cut to size for each window opening in the building. Not second-hand, not off-cuts, new glass. Walter installed them over the next 3 days, working methodically from the second floor, down-setting each pane in a bead of glazing compound and checking for drafts. When the last window was in place and the last draft was sealed, He walked the building and felt the change. The air inside was different, warmer, quieter. The rooms felt sealed against the outside in the way that rooms are supposed to feel private and contained and belonging to the people inside them. Ray Kowalski arrived on a cold afternoon, 11 days before the inspection. He was in his mid-40s, give or take the kind of age that was hard to pin down, because his face was both older and younger than it should have been. He carried a small pack and wore a military surplus jacket with no insignia on it. He stood at the front door and asked if there was room. Walter looked at him. The way this man stood, the particular quality of his stillness, the way his eyes took inventory of a room without appearing to the habit of positioning himself where he could see the entrance. Walter had worked alongside men like this over the years, on job sites where ex-military gravitated toward physical trades after coming home men who needed the clarity of a task and a result. He knew not to ask directly. He knew to offer the work first and let the conversation find its own time. "Can you work?" Walter asked. Ray looked at him. "What kind? Whatever needs doing." "All right." He moved into a room on the second floor. He did not talk much. He did not explain himself. But every morning he appeared in the workshop Walter had set up in the largest first-floor cell, and he worked without instruction, without complaint, with a precision that surprised Walter the first day, and then simply became part of how things were. 2 weeks after Ray arrived, they were the last two in the workshop after supper. Walter chiseling a mortise joint in a window frame replacement, Ray sanding a chair someone had brought in for repair. The building was quiet around them. "Iraq," Walter said after a while. Not a question. Ray did not stop sanding. 2 tours, 2004 and 2007. Hard to come back. A pause. The sandpaper kept moving. Depends what you mean by hard. I mean finding out who you are when the mission is over. Ray set the sandpaper down. He looked at the chair in front of him. When you're there, you know what's required every day. You know your job. You know who needs you. He was quiet for a moment. Coming home, there's no list. Nobody tells you what's needed. No next task, Walter said. Right. Walter set his chisel down. I know that feeling, he said. Not the way you know it. But I understand what it costs when a man doesn't know what he's for. They worked in silence after that. But it was a different kind of silence than before. The kind that means something has been said that needed saying even if neither man would have called it a conversation. The hardest item on Walter's list was the fire escape. The second floor needed a code-compliant emergency exit that didn't run through the main staircase. Walter designed it himself, working from memory of fire escape specifications he had absorbed over decades of building work. Steel stringers, wooden treads, welded brackets bolted into the stone wall. He borrowed an arc welder from Roy's shop and set it up on the ground outside the building's south wall. It took 4 days. His knees were bad going up and down the extension ladder. His shoulder gave him trouble by the second afternoon. He dropped a wrench twice on the third day because his grip was not what it had been at 60, and he picked it up both times and kept going. Ray held steel and passed tools and did not offer to take over because he understood instinctively that this was Walter's work to do. When it was finished, Walter climbed to the top, grabbed the railing with both hands, and shook it as hard as he could. It did not move. He descended, walked 10 feet away, and looked up at what he had built. Steel and wood and welded iron against an Ohio winter sky. Good, he thought. That'll hold. On the night before the inspection, they all sat at the long table for dinner. 7 people now. Walter, Eleanor, Claire Arthur Owen Ray, and Helen Garrity, a former nurse in her mid-60s who had arrived the previous week after her landlord sold the building she had rented for 9 years and the new owners wanted the unit vacant by the end of the month. Nobody mentioned the inspection. Eleanor made chicken stew from a bird someone had left on the front steps with a note that said simply, "For you." The garden contributed the last of the fall vegetables. Arthur found a bottle of cider in the donation box near the front entrance and poured a small glass for everyone who wanted one. Walter looked around the table. 2 months ago, it had been 2 of them on a concrete floor with $5. He found Eleanor's eyes across the table. She gave him the small nod he had known for 42 years, the one that meant exactly what it had always meant. We're ready, whatever comes. The next morning, Walter was up before the light. He walked the building one final time. Every switch, every faucet, every window latch, the stair rail which he gripped and leaned his full weight against, the fire escape which he descended and ascended twice, the smoke detectors he had installed in every room, the fire extinguisher mounted to the wall near the stairwell, every door which he opened and closed to confirm that each one latched cleanly from the inside. At 9:15, a white county sedan came up the gravel road with a small cloud of dust behind it. Clyde Patterson was 54 years old and had worked for the Caldwell County Code Enforcement Office for 22 years. He had condemned 14 buildings in that time. He had driven out this morning expecting this to be the 15th. He stepped out of his car with a clipboard under his arm and looked at the building. Then he looked at the people standing on the front steps, then back at the building. Walter came down the steps and extended his hand. "Walter Crane, this is my wife Eleanor. Welcome to our home." The inspector shook his hand. He said he was there to conduct a property assessment and asked if they could go inside. Walter held the door open. "After you." Clyde Patterson stepped through the front door of the old Caldwell County Jail and stopped walking. He stood in the corridor for 10 full seconds. His clipboard hung at his side. His pen hovered above the first line of the assessment form without touching it. The corridor was clean and lit. The limestone walls had been scrubbed and painted a pale cream that made the stone look warmer than stone had any right to look. The concrete floor had been swept and patched and covered with donated rugs in the areas of heaviest use. Overhead functional light fixtures ran the full length of the ceiling connected to properly coded junction boxes. But it was the cells that stopped him. The iron bars that had faced every cell were gone, replaced by wooden door frames with solid doors. Through the open doorways, he could see beds with neatly folded blankets, shelves with personal items, curtains hanging at the barred windows. Each room was different. One had a rocking chair in the corner. One had a small bookshelf built into the wall beside the bed. One had a hand-knitted blanket at the foot of the bed and a pair of infant shoes on the shelf, very small, barely larger than his fist. He walked the corridor slowly, looking into each room. Walter followed at a distance of 2 steps, not explaining anything, not pointing anything out, the way a craftsman follows someone looking at his work, letting the work speak. They went through the kitchen where the inspector noted the counter installation and the plumbing connection and the organized shelves of provisions. They went upstairs where he tested the handrail and the window latches and the plumbing in the second-floor bathroom. He stepped out onto the fire escape and tested it the way Walter had tested it, gripping the railing and applying his full weight, bouncing on the treads from top to bottom. He came back inside and looked at the welded brackets where the steel met the stone. "Who built this?" he asked. "I did," Walter said. "You welded these brackets yourself?" "Borrowed a welder from a friend." The inspector crouched down and looked at the connection for a long time. The bolts were clean. The welds were solid and even. He stood up and wrote something on his clipboard. When they had walked the full perimeter and come back to the front entrance, Clyde Patterson stood on the front steps and looked through his notes. "Mr. Crane," he said, "I want to be straight with you. I drove out here this morning expecting to condemn this property. The county records have listed it as uninhabitable since 1997. "That was before we fixed it," Walter said. "You did more than fix it." The inspector flipped through the pages. "Electrical work meets code. Plumbing passes. The structural integrity of the building is sound. That fire escape is honestly better than what I see in most commercial installations." He paused. "There are 3 items. The second-floor bathroom needs a ventilation fan. You need a handrail on the exterior front steps, and I'd recommend a carbon monoxide detector near the wood-burning stove." Walter nodded. "I can have all 3 done before next week." The inspector closed his clipboard. "I'm going to file this as conditionally compliant. 30 days to address those items, then I'll do a follow-up." He looked at Walter, then at Eleanor, who was standing quietly beside her husband. Then at the building behind them, at the fire escape he had tested, at the warm light visible through the windows at the garden beds along the south wall, brown now in late autumn, but clearly and intentionally planted. "I came here to shut this down," Clyde Patterson said. "I can't." He shook Walter's hand and walked to his car. At the door of the sedan he paused and turned back. He looked at Walter for a moment. "Those doors in the rooms," he said, "they all latch from the inside. Is that right?" Walter looked at him steadily. "In a jail," Walter said, "the doors lock from the outside." He let that sit. "This isn't a jail anymore." The inspector stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he got into his car and drove down the gravel road, and Walter stood on the front steps and watched until the dust behind the car had settled completely. Eleanor came and stood beside him. She put her hand on his arm. "We passed," she said. He put his hand over hers. They stood there together in the December cold in front of the building they had bought for $6 and filled with something no inspector's form had a category for, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. The article ran on a Sunday. Diane Marsh had been a reporter at the Caldwell County Courier for 19 years, and she knew the difference between a story that people would read and a story that people would need. She had spent 3 hours at the long table in the jail's kitchen drinking the coffee Eleanor poured and writing in a spiral notebook while Walter answered her questions in the plain and economical way of a man who was not accustomed to talking about himself. She photographed the corridor, the kitchen, the garden beds along the south wall, the workshop Walter had built in the largest first-floor cell, with its organized tools and its workbench and the chair someone had brought in for repair sitting half-finished in the corner. She photographed the long table. She photographed Walter's hands, though she didn't ask permission for that one, and he didn't notice until it was done. The headline read, "Couple Abandoned by Children Turns Jail into Home for the Forgotten." The paper had a website. The article was shared once, and then it was shared by people who had seen it shared, and then it was shared by people who did not know the Caldwell County Courier existed and had never heard of Millvale, Ohio. Within 4 days, it had traveled far enough that a producer at a national morning television program called the paper's main number looking for a way to reach the Cranes. Walter did 2 interviews. a local television station, and then a reporter from a wire service who drove 4 hours and spent most of those hours on a gravel road looking for a jail he kept thinking he must have passed. After the second interview, Walter told Eleanor he was finished with that part of it. She handled the rest with the same organized calm she had once used to manage a classroom of 25 8-year-olds during a fire drill, moving things along, keeping the essential information clear, never losing the thread. The donations changed after the coverage. Not just blankets and canned food. Checks arrived, some of them substantial, from people in states. Walter had never visited people who had read the article or seen the segment and felt something shift in their chest and reached for their checkbooks before the feeling passed. A lumber yard in the next county sent a full load of materials on a flatbed with a note that said, "Use it." A foundation in Columbus mailed a check large enough to cover the building's insurance for a year. A retired architect who had seen the story offered to draw up proper renovation plans at no charge. And when Walter looked at the drawings, he understood immediately that the man knew what he was doing. Walter was uncomfortable with the money in a way he couldn't entirely explain. "We didn't ask for this," he said to Eleanor one evening, holding a check from a woman in Vermont whose return address showed a town he'd never heard of. "We didn't ask for any of it," Eleanor said. "Not the blankets, not Roy's clearance items, not Glenn's 2 days of electrical work. We did the work, and people responded. The scale changed. That's not the same as something being wrong." He thought about that for a while. Then he deposited the check. He used the donated materials to finish the second floor properly. Real insulation in the walls. Drywall taped and finished. A bathroom on each floor with hot water from a donated water heater. He built 6 more rooms upstairs, each one complete, each one with a bed and a closet and a shelf and a window that opened and closed and a door with a working lock on the inside. 14 rooms, 14 doors, all of them opening from the inside. By February, the building had capacity for 14 residents, and 10 of the rooms were occupied. A woman in her early 60s who had lost her apartment when her landlord sold the building. A young couple who had been living in their truck since the husband lost a construction job in November. Ray Kowalski had moved into the workshop rhythm so completely that Walter had stopped thinking of him as a resident and started thinking of him as a partner, which was a word Walter did not use lightly. The black SUV appeared on a Saturday morning in late February. Walter was in the workshop when he heard it. He knew the sound before he saw the vehicle, the particular smoothness of an engine that had never been asked to do anything difficult. He walked to the front of the building and stepped out onto the porch. Richard Crane was standing beside his car, looking at the building in the way a man looks at something his mind keeps trying to file in a category it doesn't fit. He was wearing a wool overcoat and dress shoes on a gravel road, and the shoes were already dusty. He had seen the story. Walter knew that without asking. Somebody in one of Richard's meetings or one of his client dinners had mentioned it, or it had appeared on the screen in the corner of a restaurant, and Richard had seen his father's face and the words "abandoned by children" underneath it, and he had sat with that for however many weeks it took him to get in the car. Walter did not go down the porch steps to meet him. He waited. Richard came up the steps and they stood on the porch of the building that had been worth $6 in November. "Dad," Richard said. "Come inside," Walter said. "It's cold." They sat at the long table. Eleanor set coffee in front of Richard and sat down beside Walter. Richard looked around the kitchen the way he looked at properties he was evaluating, which was quickly and with the practiced efficiency of someone who has trained himself to assess value in seconds. But somewhere in the middle of looking, he stopped doing it that way and started looking differently at the jars of dried herbs and the drawings that Owen had taped to the refrigerator and the schedule Eleanor had posted on the wall with everyone's name on it. "This isn't sustainable," Richard said. It was the thing he had prepared to say. Walter could tell the opening of the argument he had built in his head during the drive from Columbus. "You're operating something that functions as a group home without licensing, without insurance, without any professional oversight. One injury and everything you've built here is gone." "We've been here 4 months," Walter said. "Nobody's been injured." "That's luck. That's not a plan." Walter set his coffee cup down. He looked at his son across the table, across the 8 feet of lumber he had built with donated wood and Roy Hobbs's oil, and he said what needed to be said without raising his voice because the truth doesn't require volume. "I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it all the way through." Richard waited. "You drove your mother and me to a motel off the highway. You left us with 2 suitcases and a promise you never meant to keep. You said you would call. You didn't call. We called you 3 times over 2 weeks. Voicemail. We called Catherine. Voicemail. We tried Daniel. The number was disconnected." Walter paused. "We ran out of money after 5 days. We slept on cots in a church. Then your mother walked to the county records office in her good shoes and found a derelict jail for $6 because it was the only thing we could afford, and we moved in with no electricity and no running water and a toolbox somebody left in a closet 30 years ago." He let that sit. "You didn't do that because you were busy with a project. You did it because you had a problem you wanted off your desk, and we were the problem. I'm not asking you to argue with that. I'm asking you to know it. Because a man who doesn't know what he's done can't decide what to do next." Richard looked at the table. The coffee in front of him was still steaming. He had not touched it. "I was going to call," he said. "I know you believe that." The room was quiet. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of Owen moving around in his room, the particular creak of the second-floor boards that Walter had learned to recognize. "There's something else I want to say," Walter continued. "You're going to tell me this place isn't sustainable. You might even be right about some of the technical problems, but I want you to think about something before you come back here with solutions." He leaned forward slightly. "When I'm gone, Richard, when these hands have done their last job and I'm in the ground, what is it that I built? What will be standing? What will people point to and say that man did that?" Richard looked at his father. "I know the answer now," Walter said. "That's not something I was sure of a year ago. It took a jail on a gravel road to show it to me." He sat back. "I'm not angry at you. I want to be clear about that. I'm not. But I won't pretend it didn't happen, because pretending things didn't happen is how men end up old without ever having been honest about anything." Richard sat at that table for a long time after Walter stopped talking. He looked at the schedule on the wall with the names. He looked at the drawings on the refrigerator. He looked at his father's hands, the crooked index finger, the scars on the knuckles. Then he stood up, shook Eleanor's hand, which was not a thing he would have done 6 months ago, and said quietly that he would have his attorney look into the licensing requirements. Walter said nothing to that. Richard walked out and sat in his car for 15 minutes before he drove away. 3 weeks later, Eleanor received paperwork from the county planning office indicating that a revised zoning classification had been applied to the property, the kind of quiet administrative change that protects a use from future challenge. The paperwork came through an attorney whose firm address was in Columbus. Walter did not call Richard to acknowledge it. Richard did not call to take credit for it. That was the arrangement, unspoken and sufficient. The work with Owen Burke had been going on since November, though neither of them would have called it what it was. It started in the workshop. Owen appeared there one afternoon the way young men appear in places where skilled work is being done when they are curious, but not yet sure they have permission to be curious. He sat on an overturned crate near the door and watched Walter work. Walter did not tell him to leave and did not invite him to stay, which in the language of workshops meant he could stay. The next afternoon, Owen appeared again, and the one after that. On the fourth day, Walter looked up from the mortise he was cutting and said, "Hand me that mallet." Owen handed him the mallet. That was how it began. Walter taught Owen to read the grain of wood before cutting it to find the direction the fiber was running and work with it instead of against it. He taught him to measure twice and then measure again before cutting, because wood that is cut short cannot be uncut. He taught him that a joint that fits poorly will never hold the way a joint that fits well will hold, and that the shortcuts you take in a joint always show up later, usually when someone is depending on the piece not to fail. Eleanor was teaching Owen in the mornings at the kitchen table before breakfast, working through mathematics and reading comprehension with the patient and systematic methods she had used for 35 years. Owen had been out of school for 2 years. He was behind in ways he was embarrassed about, and the embarrassment sometimes made him resistant, but Eleanor had spent 3 decades with children who were resistant, and she knew how to wait it out. The morning Owen passed his GED examination, he walked into the kitchen holding the letter. His face had an expression Walter had not seen on him before, something open and slightly stunned, like a man looking at a view he had not expected on the other side of a hill. 92nd percentile in reading, Owen said. Eleanor put the letter on the refrigerator door next to Owen's drawings and the meal schedule and the photograph someone had taken of all of them at the table on Christmas Eve. Walter was in the doorway of the workshop. He looked at Owen for a moment. "What do you want to do next?" he asked. Owen looked at the letter on the refrigerator. Then he looked at Walter. "I want to go to a real school, study building trades." "I'll write you a recommendation," Walter said. "I've had you in my workshop for 4 months. I have things to say." He wrote the letter that evening, 4 paragraphs, specific and plain, the way he wrote everything. He said that Owen Burke had learned to read a grain, to cut a joint, to think about what a piece of furniture needed before deciding how to build it. He said that Owen was a young man who had been failed by several things and had not been made bitter by the experience, which was not common and was worth noting. He said that he would hire Owen himself if he were in a position to be hiring. Roy Hobbs found a car for Owen. An old sedan with dull paint and reliable brakes, sold by a man Roy knew for $200. Owen enrolled at the Caldwell County Community College in the fall in the building trades program, and on the first day, Walter stood on the porch and watched the car disappear down the gravel road and around the curve onto Hadley. Eleanor came and stood beside him. "He'll be fine," she said. "I know," Walter said. "That's why I'm not worried." Claire Ashford's daughter was born on a Tuesday in March at the county hospital, 6 pounds and 9 ounces in a room where Eleanor held one of Claire's hands, and Helen Garrity, who had 30 years of nursing experience and had been living at the jail since January, held the other. Walter drove them to the hospital in Roy's truck at 2 in the morning, exceeding the posted speed limit for the first time in his life by a margin that surprised even him. He sat in the waiting room for 4 hours with a cup of vending machine coffee and a 2-year-old magazine about fishing in Montana, and when Helen came out to tell him the baby had arrived and everyone was well, he nodded and finished his coffee. They named the baby Rose. Walter built a crib. He had built 3 cribs in his life, one for each of his own children, the first when he was 29 and did not know yet how much he did not know. This crib was better than any of them. He used cherry wood that Roy had gotten from a man who was clearing an estate sale, beautiful material, the kind that comes from a tree that took a long time to grow. He worked on it for 4 days, fitting the joints by hand, checking every dimension twice, sanding every surface until it was smooth enough that there was no possibility of a splinter. When he set the crib in Claire's room and Claire lay Rose in it for the first time, he stood in the doorway and looked at the room. A jail cell once. A room where a young woman had arrived with a bruise on her jaw and no last name running towards something she could not name from something she could not say. And now a room with curtains and a shelf with a small collection of books and a crib made from cherry wood by a man who had built it the same way he built everything, as though the person it was for deserved the best he could do. He went back to the workshop and cleaned his tools. Catherine Crane Howell came in June. She drove up the gravel road in a minivan with her 2 children in the back seat, a boy of 9 named Marcus and a girl of 7 named Lily, and she parked in front of the building and sat in the car for a long time before she got out. Walter saw the car from the kitchen window. He did not go outside. He let her come in when she was ready. The afternoon was long and careful, the way afternoons are when people are trying to find their way around a large thing that is sitting in the middle of a room. Eleanor showed her through the building. Marcus went to the workshop, and Walter let him try the handsaw with both his hands, guiding the blade, and the boy's face was the face of a 9-year-old who has just discovered that things can be made, which is one of the best faces a person can wear. In the late afternoon, Walter and Catherine sat on the front porch in the 2 rocking chairs. Eleanor was inside. The children were in the garden with Arthur, who was explaining to Lily the difference between a tomato that was ready and a tomato that needed another week. "I need to tell you something," Catherine said. "All right." "I knew when Richard came with the plan. I knew it wasn't temporary. I knew he wasn't going to call." She was looking at her hands in her lap. "And I stood there in your kitchen, and I didn't say anything because it was easier not to. Because Richard had decided, and arguing with Richard has always cost more than most things are worth." She stopped. "That's not an excuse. I know it isn't." Walter rocked slowly. The Ohio evening was coming on warm and green, the fields along Hadley Road catching the late light. "What were you afraid of?" he asked. She looked at him, surprised by the question. "I was afraid it would be complicated, that there would be a fight, that Richard would be angry and I'd be the one who caused it." Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at the boards under his feet on the porch, boards he had laid himself from reclaimed lumber, each one fitted tight to the next. "You knew it was wrong," he said. "You knew it the same way I know when a joint isn't square before I even put a level on it. That feeling is there before the measurement. You just chose not to say so." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt," Walter said. "It did. Still does some days." He rocked forward and back. "But I want to tell you something about the way I understand things now after all these months in this building." He paused. "I spent 42 years making things that had to hold. doors and floors and staircases and joints. And the thing I learned, the thing every tradesman learns if he lasts long enough, is that you can see exactly where a thing failed after it fails. The weakness is obvious then, but the skill isn't in identifying the failure. The skill is in choosing to build it right in the first place, before anyone is watching, before it matters, because it's going to matter eventually. Catherine was quiet. "You know what the right thing was," Walter said. "You knew it then. That's not nothing. Some people never know. What you do with the knowing now, that's what's left to decide." He reached over and put his hand briefly on her arm. Not an embrace, just the plain acknowledgement of one person to another in the way of a man who does not traffic in gestures he doesn't mean. "That table in the kitchen seats 8, he said. "I built it that way on purpose. There's a place at it for you." Catherine came back in July and again in August, and after that every 2 weeks, and then every week bringing groceries and books for Eleanor's reading group and the particular energy of children who have been told that the garden is theirs to explore. Marcus learned the names of every plant. Lily adopted Arthur as a kind of grandfather, which Arthur accepted with the dignified pleasure of a man who has been waiting for a grandchild without knowing it. She never mentioned Richard. Walter never asked. Some debts take longer to settle than others, and some may never fully settle, and a man learns to distinguish between the ones worth pursuing and the ones to set down and walk past. Daniel called on Sundays. He could not visit easily from Seattle, but he called and he asked about the building and the residents and Walter's current projects with the genuine curiosity of a man who is trying to be present across a distance he has allowed to grow too large. He sent money each month always to Eleanor, always without fanfare. He never explained the years of silence, and Eleanor never asked, because he was there now, and there now was what there was. The nonprofit paperwork was completed in April. A lawyer in Millvale had read the article and offered to handle the filing without charge. They registered as the Open Door Community Home, which was what Eleanor had called it in her own mind since the first night she propped the front door open and said anyone was welcome. Walter used the donated materials and the grant money to finish the building properly. 14 rooms on 2 floors, each one right, each one the way he would have built it for his own family. He installed a bathroom on each floor with hot water. He put proper insulation in every wall. He built a covered porch along the south side of the building facing the garden with a long outdoor table and benches for summer evenings, and a smaller table near the door for the mornings when people wanted coffee outside. He was 77 now. His knees were worse. His back gave him trouble every cold morning, and Ohio had no shortage of cold mornings. He moved slower than he had in November, and he dropped things sometimes in the workshop, small things, a chisel or a clamp, because his grip was not what it had been. He noted these things the way a craftsman notes the condition of his tools without self-pity as information. He kept working. It was on a Thursday morning in October, almost exactly 1 year from the afternoon they had driven out Hadley Road with the pastor, that a car turned at the end of the gravel road and came slowly toward the building. Walter saw it from the workshop window. Not a truck, not an old sedan, a car that had seen better years but had been cared for clean and traveling carefully on the gravel. It stopped in front of the building. An elderly man got out first, moving slowly, and then went around to the passenger side and helped a woman out, and they stood together in the driveway and looked at the building. Walter set down what he was working on and walked out. The man was about 70 solid through the chest, in the way of someone who had done physical work for most of his life. The woman was a few years younger, with the careful bearing of someone holding themselves together in circumstances that have required considerable holding. She was carrying a small suitcase in one hand and had her other hand through her husband's arm. The man's face stopped Walter, not because he recognized it. He didn't know these people, but he recognized the expression on it, the way you recognize something you have seen before in a mirror. The look of a man trying to understand how he arrived at a moment that was not part of any plan he had ever made. The look of a man who has been reliable and capable and present for 70 years and is standing in a driveway with a suitcase because the reliability and capability and presence turned out not to be enough to guarantee what he thought it guaranteed. Walter had worn that look. He walked toward them. "Can I help you?" he asked. The woman spoke first. Her name was Miriam Voss. Her husband was George. They had driven from a town 40 miles east. Their son lived in a city, and they had been planning to spend the winter with him, but when they arrived at his address, the locks had been changed, and there was no answer from his phone. A woman at a church in the next town over had mentioned the open door. She said all of this carefully and without self-pity, in the manner of someone who has rehearsed the explanation, because saying it plainly requires practice. Walter looked at the suitcase, at the way George was standing slightly behind his wife, in the involuntary posture of a man absorbing something he had not yet named. "Come inside," Walter said. "Eleanor's got the kettle on." After Miriam went with Eleanor to see the rooms, Walter and George sat at the kitchen table together. George wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee and looked at the surface of the table, the wood grain, the smooth finish. "You built this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "From lumber someone gave me." George nodded slowly. "I was a commercial electrician. 34 years. He looked at the light fixtures mounted in the ceiling, the wiring that ran along the top of the wall. "That's good work," he said, nodding toward the installation. "Man named Glenn Pruitt did most of it. He knew what he was doing. He did." They sat in the quiet for a moment. Outside, the October wind moved across the fields and found the gaps in the old stone walls the way it always did this time of year, a low sound not unpleasant like the building breathing. "My son," George started. Then he stopped. "You don't have to explain it," Walter said. "I keep trying to." "I know. I did the same thing for a while. Try to find the explanation that made it make sense." Walter looked at his coffee. "Eventually I stopped looking for that and started looking for what I was going to do with what I had." George looked at him. "How long did that take?" "Longer than I'd like to admit. But there was a building that needed work, so I had something to do with my hands while I was figuring it out." He paused. "That helps. Considerably." Walter took George through the building that afternoon, the way he had taken Clyde Patterson through it, not selling anything, just walking through what had been made. The rooms, the workshop, the fire escape, the covered porch, the garden that Eleanor had planted from seed in the spring and that had produced across the summer more than they needed enough to share with the food bank and the diner and the neighbors on Hadley Road. George walked beside him and was mostly quiet, asking a practical question here and there, the questions of someone who understands how things are built and wants to know the specifics. Why the door frames were built to a certain width, why the porch roof was pitched at that particular angle, why the workshop benches were mounted at that height. Walter answered each one directly, and by the time they had walked the whole building, something had shifted in the way George was standing. The particular weight that had been in his shoulders when he got out of the car was still there, but it had changed the way a man's posture changes when he starts to believe there might be something useful he can do. "I haven't done any electrical work since I retired," George said. "Glenn Pruitt comes by about once a month to check on things. He'd probably welcome the company." George looked at the wiring along the ceiling one more time and said nothing further, but Walter had worked alongside enough men to know when something had landed. That evening, 16 people sat at the long table for dinner. Walter stood up at his end of the table. He was not a man who liked speeches, and everyone at that table knew it, so they were quiet in the particular way that people are quiet when they know what they are about to hear will be short and will mean what it says. A year ago, Walter said, "Eleanor and I had 2 suitcases and $6. He looked around the table. Claire, with Rose in her arms, the baby 8 months old, and regarding the assembled company with the serene authority of someone who has recently discovered that the world is full of people whose primary function is to be interested in her. Arthur, with his glass of cider. Owen, home for the weekend from the community college, sitting next to Ray, who had come to the table in a clean shirt. Helen Garrity, with her hands folded in her lap. George and Miriam Voss one day, in still finding their footing, but at the table. And all the others who had arrived in 1s and 2s, and found a door that was open. "We didn't know what we were doing," Walter said. "We still don't most days." A few people laughed. Arthur laughed loudest. "But here is what I know. We didn't rescue anybody. We left the door open. Every person at this table rescued themselves. We just made sure there was somewhere to come to." He sat down. Eleanor found his hand under the table and held it. After dinner, the two of them sat on the front porch in the rocking chairs while the sound of dishes being washed and people talking carried through the limestone walls behind them. The October air was cool but not yet cold. The garden had gone to its autumn colors, brown and gold, and the last of the green. In the fading light, the vines that someone had planted at the base of the south wall in the spring had climbed the iron bars of the ground floor windows and wound themselves through the steel and the stone, and in this light, the bars did not look like what they were. They looked like a trellis, something built to hold a living thing up. Eleanor took the photograph from her purse. She had carried it every day for a year. The wedding photograph, 1972. Walter in a borrowed suit, Eleanor in her mother's dress, both of them grinning at the camera with the particular certainty of people who have just promised each other something large and have no doubt at all that they mean it. Walter took it from her and looked at it. "We look so young," he said. "We look so sure." "We were sure," Eleanor said. "We were absolutely sure." He looked at the photograph a long moment. Then he set it on the arm of the rocking chair between them, where both of them could see it, and he looked out at the building, at the lights in every window, at the vines climbing the iron bars. He had been asking himself a question for a year, the question that woke him at 3 in the morning in the Pine View Motor Lodge and in the Fellowship Hall and on the concrete floor of this building on the first night. The question that sits in the chest of every man who has spent his life making things, who has devoted himself to the plain and difficult task of building things that hold, and who eventually arrives at the age where he has to look at what he has made and ask whether it will still be standing when he is not. He had his answer. Not because the building was beautiful, though in its way it was. Not because the story had traveled far, though it had. But because of the doors. 14 of them solid wood hung on proper hinges, latching cleanly from the inside. Because a former county jail was full tonight of people who had come to it with nothing and were building something in the rooms he had built for them. Because Owen Burke was studying building trades 40 miles away in a car Roy Hobbs had found and would one day teach someone else what he had learned here. Because George Voss was going to find Glenn Pruitt and they were going to talk about electrical work. 2 old tradesmen sitting in a workshop the way tradesmen do, the knowledge passing from one pair of hands to another. Because the things a man builds with honesty and care do not stop when he stops. They keep building. Walter Crane rocked slowly in his chair and listened to the sound of his home around him, the 16 people living in the place he had built with $6 and a borrowed arc welder and a level someone had left in a closet 30 years ago, still true, still reading perfectly level after all that time. He picked up the wedding photograph from the arm of the chair and looked at it one more time. 2 people grinning at the camera in 1972, certain of something. They had been right. Not about everything. Not about the children. Not about the plan that had no plan. Not about what was coming or how it would feel when it arrived. But about the one thing that matters most. The thing you decide before you know what you are deciding. The thing that holds every other thing up, the way a good foundation holds a house. They had been right about each other. He set the photograph back between them. Eleanor reached over without looking and rested her hand on his arm. The lights burned in every window of the building behind them. The vines held to the iron bars. The October air moved across the fields of Ohio clean and cold and carrying with it the smell of turned earth and distance. The door behind them was open. It had been open for a year. It was going to stay that way.